Alrighty, so last we left off with the axial skeleton, we were talking about the crista galli. And again, the crista galli is this bone right here. It's housed in the ethmoid bone area. And it's important because you have the falx cerebri there. And not only that, and that's anteriorly of the crista galli. Not only that, in the same area, you're going to have the cerebriform plate of the ethmoid bone. Now, that sits like a crib on either side of the crista galli. It supports the olfactory bulb and allows passage through its grooves by foramina of olfactory nerves. The nerves are then transmitted to the nasal canal, the apex of the nasal canal. So the cribriform is this little area right here as it dips around here. And then the crista galli, as you remember, is right here. So we're going to jump out of those two for a moment, and we're going to jump into the ethmoid. I'm sorry, out of the ethmoid into the sutures of the cranial. And so let's put this back on this little guy here. Alrighty. Alrighty. Awesome. So the sutures that we're going to be looking at is the coronal suture, which is this one here. And then we're going to be looking at the sagittal suture, which is this one here. Squamous suture, which is over here. Let's see if we can look at it better over here. Squamous suture, which is over here. And the last suture that we're going to take a look at is the lambdoid suture. If you can see, that is right here. Alrighty, so those are the sutures. Now we're going to take a look at the facial bones of our little skeletal guy here. So we can get him to sit up correctly. There we go. Alrighty, so we're taking a look at the facial bones here. Let's go ahead and put our little camera here on the tripod so we can get a better view. Alrighty, so for the facial features, we're going to be looking at the maxilla, which is this area right here. All that right there. Next, we're also going to be looking at the alveolar process, which is right here in the teeth area, right there. The nasal, which is this area up here. Then we're going to be looking at the zygomatic area, which I think is a pretty cool area. Get a little low here so we can see it. Which is this area right here. And the cool thing, if you can see the zygomatic area in this area. So the cool thing about the zygomatic area that creates the arch is it's formed by the temporal bone and the zygomatic process. So that's how you get that arcs. Alrighty. Next, we're going to be looking at the ethmoid, which is in this area here. So you have this zygomatic, ethmoid, nasal, all in that area there. Next, we're going to be looking at the vomer, which is this right here. And the nasal septum is formed by the vomer bone and the ethmoid bone. Next, we're going to be looking at the inferior nasal concha, which is right here in these areas here. And the inferior nasal concha is important because it keeps the airways open to allow us to get air. So it allows us to keep the airflow in those areas. Alrighty, next we are going to be looking at the mandible. And the first area we're going to be looking at in the mandible is the mandible body. Let's see if we can get this here. Right here. And the second part we're going to be looking at for the mandible is the mandible angle, which is here in this area. Next, we're going to be looking at the mandibular ramus, which is here in this area. Next, we're going to be looking at the mandibular notch. It's a little notch up here. And then next, we're going to be looking at the mandibular condyle, which is this area up here. And lastly, we're going to be looking at the coronoid process, which is right here before you get to the cheekbone. Alrighty, so that completes the mandible portion. Next, we're going to take a look at the vertebral column. Alright, so we're going to take a look at all the vertebrae here in the vertebral column. Let's flip them around here and see if we can get a good view of the column here. Alrighty, that's a better view. Alrighty. So there are 4 types of curves you're going to find in the vertebral column. And the 4 curves that you're going to find are the anteriorly convex, which happens in the cervical and the sacrum. I'm sorry, you're looking at the anteriorly convex, which is happening in the cervical and lumbar, and then the anteriorly concave, which happens in the sacrum and the thoracics. So cervical are the first 7 here. And then after you move from the cervical, you move down to the next 12, which are the thoracic spine. And again, the thoracic and the sacrum are the anteriorly concave, and the lumbar and the cervical are the anteriorly convex. And then after you move from the 12, you move into 5 more, which are the lumbar vertebrae of the vertebral column. And then you move into the sacrum, which is this area right here. And the sacrum is usually 5 fused vertebrae here. And then you move into the coccyx. And those are about 4 vertebrae, 3 to 4 vertebrae that are fused together to complete that as well. And the cool thing that you're going to find in these areas is you have a primary area and a secondary area, and the primary curves are the thoracic and the sacrum. So you have the sacrum and you have the 12 vertebrae of the thoracic. So sacrum, 12 vertebrae of the thoracic. And these are primary because the sacrum and the thoracics develop in the fetal. So they're developed at fetal development stage. And then the secondary is the cervical and the lumbar. And these are secondary. So you have the lumbar here and the cervical here. And these are secondary because the lumbar is usually formed when the infant begins to sit up and walk around year 1. And the cervical is secondary because this is when the infant, usually at 4 months, begins to raise their head. So this is when they start lifting their head up. And I don't know if you've seen babies or not, but babies usually have a hard time holding their head up, usually before 4 months. And this is the reason why, because these secondary vertebrae here in the cervical aren't formed completely or developed to where the child can hold their neck up. Also in the cervical spine area, you're going to find the atlas, which is this flat one right here. And the cool thing, it's the C1. And the cool thing about the atlas, its axis is right here. The atlas is a little bit flat, but the atlas, it articulates with the concave facets occipitally, which articulate with the rounded condyles that project from the inferior aspect of the occipital bone. So basically what the atlas is doing is, to shorten that, is the atlas is here. It articulates with the occipital bone facets here, and what that does is it allows us to nod our head forward and backwards. So that's the motion that we get by doing that. So that's a really cool thing there. And the unique structure of the cervical spine, the traverse, is that it doesn't have a traverse because of this shape. It's more of a box shape, if you can see it. I've turned it to the side here. It's more of a box shape for the cervical spine, whereas you can see the thoracic and the lumbar are not. And the reason being is because they have processes that the Spinonis process that the cervical doesn't have, to where it protrudes off here to the side a little bit closer. You can see the box there of the cervical, and then you can see the difference in the thoracic. The next cool thing here is through the foramina, you're going to have nerves and arteries and veins that pass through it. So that's also another good point to point out here. That's where the spinal column goes through, and it's kind of shaped circular, and you're going to have a whole bunch of nerves and arteries that go through it. So the next thing that we're going to talk about, since we've gone through the lumbar, the thoracic, we're going to flip him around and we're going to talk about the sternum. Awesome. Alrighty. So the sternum, the areas that we're going to talk about in the sternum are the manubrium, and the manubrium area of the sternum. Let's see if we can get a better view here. is this area right here. Alrighty, the next area that we're going to talk about is the body of the sternum, which is in here. We're going to talk about the xiphoid process, which is right here. And the next area we're going to talk about is the jugular notch, which is up here. Lastly, we're going to talk about the ribs. And the cool thing about the ribs is you have some true ribs and you have some ribs that aren't true, also known as false ribs, and some floating ribs. So the true ribs are located here. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ribs. And then you have the 7th rib, which is right here, which is fused with that rib right there, right here, which starts the false ribs. They're false ribs because they're not connected to the sternum. They are connected, however, to the vertebrae, just like the true ribs are. And then you have 2 little bones here. These are called floating ribs. They're floating ribs because they're kind of just out there floating. They are connected back there to the vertebrae, but they're kind of just floating around. And that's how they articulate with the vertebrae. So that concludes this video for the axial skeleton. Thank you.